All right, welcome everyone to this special presentation. This is a addition to the normal lecture content for week 10, a bonus for you, if you might like to think of it that way. This presentation is going into a little bit more detail about the political economy of one of the contemporary conflicts that we touched on in week 10, to kind of illustrate what a political economy analysis of a current war would look like. And this presentation is called War in Ukraine, From Reform to Revolution and to Rupture. Like I mentioned in the week 10 lecture, my PhD and a lot of my research is focused on the war in Ukraine, and especially since 2014 and the war in Donbass, and has obviously continued through to the Russian invasion of 2022. I also mentioned in week 10 as well that I used to work as a conflict analyst for the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, and Ukraine was one of the three conflicts that I analyzed. There was Ukraine, Myanmar, and also the Israel-Palestine conflict too. So I'm going to go here into a little bit more detail about the war in Ukraine, talking about its context, the antecedents of it, what led up to the 2014 war, and then discuss, well, what did the political economy of Ukraine look like during the war in Donbass up to and including the 2022 Russian invasion. I've also just got a content warning here that a lot of the images I'll share, obviously, from the time of contemporaneous conflict in Ukraine. I'm trying to share them for educational and analytic purposes. And many of the pictures in this presentation are actually from my field research as well. And obviously, there's going to be quite a lot of academic discussion and analysis relating to this particular conflict. So that's just a content warning for you. And of course, as well, if I can progress my slide. The topics that will be introduced not only in this presentation, but throughout week 10, including in the tutorials, obviously may be very distressing, upsetting, and difficult to work through. I also just have a brief comment there that I'm always obviously available for any debriefing or chats as you would like. Your tutor of your respective class is also very much available as well. I've also put there Monash Counselling services too, if you need that. And Dr. Zahra Ghazarian, who's the head of the Politics International Relations Department, and my boss is also available if there's any concerns or queries too. So this is, again, obviously very difficult conversations, but also important to have them, and especially with a political economy lens so that we can better understand contemporaneous conflicts. So this is what the bonus lecture will be looking like today. We're going to firstly touch on the period of reform. This is when the Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s, as we've discussed in a previous class. And we're going to track, well, how did Ukraine evolve as an independent state once the Soviet Union dissolved? And then we're going to look at the revolution, or the Maidan revolution, or the revolution of dignity, or the Euromaidan, as it was always known in most Western outlets. We're going to talk about, well, how did that transpire, and then how did the subsequent war in Donbass develop after that point. And then finally, it's going to take us to Rupture, which is from the Russian invasion until today. And we'll also, right at the end of the bonus lecture, go into a little bit, well, what is the current updated state of play between Ukraine and Russia? And I'll be presenting some maps to demonstrate exactly where the warring parties are and the most recent battleground developments. So Ukraine was obviously a member of the Soviet Union, and we've also already discussed quite a bit about the Soviet Union, well, especially its dissolution more than the actual Soviet Union itself. But I did mention in that earlier lecture that Ukraine was one of the constituent and key parts of the central Soviet Union. And Ukraine's economy was very much based, as it is still kind of now, on primary agricultural products, especially wheat, but more broadly than just wheat, a whole range of different agricultural products, which was focused, as it was, on the meeting the consumption requirements of the broader USSR. So Ukraine was seen as kind of like the breadbasket of the old Soviet Union, not just for wheat, but for lots of other fruits, vegetables, and foodstuffs as well. And it was also very, very important for raw materials too, especially coal in the Donbass region, which is in the eastern region of the country, which is then subsequently where the conflict in 2014 began. But also other raw materials such as steel and the like. And importantly, too, Ukraine was a really crucial part of the Soviet Union's military-industrial complex as well. It had very important missile factories as well as other armament factories, and it was very, very interconnected. And we didn't really go into this that much in the Soviet Union or the dissolution of the Soviet Union lecture, but like many members of the Soviet Union, the economies of the constituent states or so-called independent republics were highly interconnected. So, in the sense that they had very interconnected commodity chains, where one part of a certain product would be made in Ukraine, and then go to maybe Belarus, and then go to Russia to be then formed in a final product. So the interconnection of these economies were really important and would obviously play quite a large, or have quite a large impact once the Soviet Union fell. So Ukraine also has a very heterogeneous population. It has different ethnicities, lots of different religious groups, and also different languages are spoke across Ukraine as well. And a lot of the differences between the ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, language backgrounds of these of the Ukrainian population has been mobilized very much for political gains since the end of the 1990s. You probably would have heard perhaps when the war in Donbass started to really kick off in 2014 or even later on, you may have heard about the so-called linguistic divide in the country between Russian speakers in the east part of the country and then Ukrainian speakers in the West. And this was used quite often, especially also in academic studies too, as somewhat of an explanation of, well, where did this conflict occur between seemingly the East and the West of the country? Hopefully by the time we get through this, you'll see, just looking at linguistic explanations for the conflict, or even as a primary factor or any kind of as explanatory variable more broadly, is a little bit too simplistic. These populations have been living together for a very long time without any such violence as we've now seen. And there are many other factors at play, which we will discuss. But very much the linguistic, ethnic, and religious backgrounds of populations have certainly been played on for political reasons to mobilize for violence, as we'll also touch on. So now let's touch on Ukraine in the independent period. I'm just having a drink here of it's a really wonderful drink called Samahan. It's a Sri Lankan drink, and it's very, very good for you if you've got like a little sniff or a little scratch at the back of your throat. It has 14 herbs infused in the drink, and it's really fantastic. Would highly recommend, especially as we get closer to the end of semester, as your immune system starts failing. Now let's get back to independent Ukraine. So after the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine obviously emerged as an independent country, and some of the resources that I linked in our dissolution of the Soviet Union week goes into the political factors around Ukraine's emergence and how the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus kind of conspired together to end the Soviet Union in more detail, which we won't really touch on well at all here, but Ukraine emerged as an independent state, and one of the major processes that occurred almost immediately, again, as we identified previously, was that there was a sudden promotion of reform, which was imposed on Ukraine by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, as well as through a host of Western advisors who swept into the region to advise the former Soviet Union economies. So this idea of reform was very much promoted by Western experts and Western institutions, and is very much based on the neoliberal structural adjustments, which followed the Washington Consensus principles, as we spoke about previously. So just remember, to refresh you, the Washington Consensus was a form of neoliberalism that was applied especially throughout the developing world during the 1970s and 1980s. And this was one of the kind of last hurrahs, I guess, of the formal, extensive application of the Washington Consensus, which was in the eastern part of Europe, where the previous Soviet Union states were located. So this was another widespread application of Washington Consensus policies, which is, things that we've spoken about before, like the freeing of trade, liberalization of prices, opening up the economy for the movement of capital and people, and all of the different policies that we've already noted. So this was obviously very, very different to the previous state-controlled economy that Ukraine had operated under before, which is highly interconnected and dependent upon the various other Soviet republics. And so this command economy was suddenly removed, and there was this big push for reform. Now, this did create a lot of problems. Again, as we touched on previously in our Fall of the Soviet Union week, and I'm not going to labor the point too much, but we spoke about there, and this is more in relation to Russia, but the exact same thing happened in Ukraine. There was a liberalization of prices, so the prices of like everyday products weren't kept artificially low as they were previously. The currencies, with now independent currencies, were mostly allowed to float. And then the privatization of state services happened in earnest as well, and state-owned industries too. So this had a numerous different impacts on Ukraine and its people. By liberalizing prices and freeing the movement of prices, suddenly all the most important foodstuffs and vital commodities of everyday necessity, their price skyrocketed. So you saw the prices of bread, of rice, of transport, of fuel, everything like that shooting up by hundreds of percent. So suddenly all these basic commodities became highly unaffordable for everyday Ukrainians. And as well, because many of the state-owned enterprises started to get sold off, they then fired most of their workers as well. So there started to be really widespread unemployment. And because the state's role in the economy had reduced and was in the process of being deconstructed at this time, all the people that were unemployed because they were fired from their previous jobs in state-owned enterprises, they then were unable to access either any government social support at all, or very eviscerated government social support. So that, and an amount that wasn't enough to actually live on. So these different processes suddenly made living for Ukrainians very difficult. And some other reforms too here, which are important just to briefly touch on, and we'll go in them in a bit more detail soon, is that importantly, energy prices skyrocketed. So gas, electricity prices jumped up significantly. And also because of the freeing of prices and the exceptional amount of inflation that also triggered, the value of people's savings in banks, the value of people's pensions also evaporated overnight. So all the pensions that elderly people had built up through their working lives in the Soviet Union had suddenly evaporated overnight because of these reforms. So this was the impact on the everyday people in Ukraine. But on the other hand, all these same processes also helped construct an oligarchic kleptocracy. So this basically means a kind of a structuring of government or governance, perhaps, where there's a small number of people who control a huge amount of economic and political power, and then use that economic and political power to create networks around them, which then in turn increases their political power further. So oligarchs are individuals who can mobilize both economic and political power, and the kleptocracy part is identifying a system whereby there can be benefits accrued to people um, uh, who cooperate and work with oligarchs and who enjoy their favor. So the oligarchs came to prominence in Ukraine because of these processes I identified before, and especially the sale of state-owned enterprises. Because state-owned enterprises at this time in the early 1990s, they were sold in a context where, firstly, it was difficult to value them. Secondly, they were just sold on the cheap because there was kind of a fire sale mania generated, and there was pressure to sell all the state-owned enterprises very, very quickly and for not very much. And so uh, there was an ability for people who had some kind of money and power at that time to buy these state-owned enterprises on the cheap. And many of these state-owned enterprises were actually very viable businesses that had relatively very good prospects in a lot of cases, but were either mismanaged or had degraded over the last 5 or so years of the really turbulent times at the end of the Soviet Union. But as a going concern, they were quite valuable. And the only kind of people who could snap up these assets in Ukraine were those who were already the elites in the Communist Party. So many of the previous communist leaders made a very easy transition to being the budding emerging capitalist class in Ukraine, and merged into their new roles very easily and started to buy up these very cheap state-owned enterprises throughout the country. And then they also started entering the nascent political establishment, the parliamentary political establishment in Ukraine at this time as well. So they were either MPs themselves quite often, or they were major backers of political parties, or they were involved in advisory committees, but they were very, very close to politics in Ukraine at this time. And throughout the 90s, their power just continued to increase as they were able to mobilize political power around them, but also build huge empires of economic concerns, whether that is in gas, in electricity, in coal, in agriculture, and all these kinds of different exportable and especially primary commodities. And these oligarchs also tended to, and this is maybe quite interesting part of Ukraine's development here, tended to congregate around certain regions of Ukraine. So there would be certain oligarchs who would be associated with certain parts of the country. So there was like the Donbass oligarchic clan. There was the Dnipro oligarchic clan. There's oligarchs in Kiev, oligarchs in Odessa, and the country was almost divided based on oligarchic influence into the different regions. And like I mentioned, at this time, there's widespread poverty, a huge number of excess deaths, as they were labeled as well. And we touched on this human impact a few weeks ago when we looked at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but it was incredibly significant. And a very difficult decade for Ukraine's independence. Now, over the course of the 90s, in terms of the geopolitics of the region, there was more or less a effort by the leading politicians of Ukraine to strike somewhat of a balance between relations with Russia, who was at that time led by Boris Yeltsin, and also the West. And mostly that was more or less not a particularly difficult balance to strike, especially in the early 1990s, where Boris Yeltsin in Russia was very much kind of in step with most of the Western powers. But as Russia's interest started to evolve and the country started to get back on track. And especially after the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the disaster of that, then Russia started to influence or attempt to influence Ukraine's economic and political realms. This was mobilized through either supporting directly political parties in Ukraine who would speak up for Russia's interests in the country, whether that was particular naval bases, for instance, in Sevastopol in Crimea, there's a very large naval base of the Russian army, which had been that naval base had been leased to Russia, and there was obviously a continued interest in continuing that relationship. And there was also obviously, as I noted before, a lot of ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine who had some links to Russia, who often spoke mostly Russian as well. And there was a slow effort at that time to kind of constitute them as a political, or at least have some kind of political consciousness. And it was very much in Russia's interest to foster this different sense of identity for people living in Ukraine's east, which was based on their language and also their ethnicity. So there was a lot of political concerns that Russia was interested in fostering, and also very much some economic ones too. So one of the really important parts of the geopolitical story between Russia and Ukraine is that Russia has, and has always, as we also mentioned in our Soviet Union week, has always been the big producer of oil and gas in the Soviet Union. And as I showed a map previously, all this oil and gas from Russia was transported through the Soviet Union to the other constituent parts of the USSR, but then also onwards to Europe, where most of the hard currency for selling gas and oil would come from. So Russia would sell that gas and oil to not only the Soviet republics, but also to Europe. Now, once the Soviet Union dissolved, then the previous Soviet republics then just became so-called normal customers. And it was of great interest for Russia to try to get more control of these pipelines, which had suddenly, these pipelines going through these countries were all a part of the Soviet Union. So there's no particular issue about, who owned them, because it was just the one state. But then once these countries broke up, then suddenly had all these different countries have ownership of all these different parts of the pipelines to move these commodities to Europe, which obviously was problematic for Russia because they had to pay for, like, instance, rent. Sometimes it was unreliable getting the oil and gas to Europe. And so there was an attempt by Russia to try to buy up pipelines in the former Soviet Union. And Ukraine was very much at the front of that effort as well, as Russia tried to buy up parts of the gas distribution network. And another factor here is that Russia also offered Ukraine a very heavy discount to their gas prices through most of the 1990s and the 2000s as well, which was said at the time to try to help Ukraine's economy, demonstrate the brotherly cooperation between the Slavic people of Russia and Ukraine, but also arguably, as demonstrated in the academic literature, the huge discounts that Russia gave Ukraine for gas, for example, was also a way to keep Ukraine under Russia's influence, because obviously the threat of removing that gigantic subsidy would be really devastating, because basically Ukraine's total economy relied on cheap Russian gas and energy. And by the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, it was really only because mostly of this cheap Russian energy that Ukraine was able to recover its economy somewhat. And so by the early 2000s, we had at this time in Ukraine a really long period of the same president for most of the 1990s and early 2000s. And he was seen to be leaning at the end of his tenure a bit towards Russia. There was also some really how do you say, like some very high profile corruption and gangsterish violence uh, um, problems as well, to put it lightly, maybe, where the president was accused of ordering a journalist to be killed, and that journalist's body was found decapitated in a forest outside of Kiev, and also a lot of corruption charges against the president as well. So he suddenly became highly unpopular in one of the elections of the early 2000s. He was then accused of fixing the election because he was trying to hand off power to his young protege, and this protege was had the name of Viktor Yanukovych, who would become a very important player later on in the 2000s. So the first president of Ukraine was trying to hand off power to Yanukovych, and Yanukovych was part of a political party which is from the eastern part of Ukraine, and was seen also to be very Russian leaning. And at this time, the election, which was found to be fraudulent, caused an uproar amongst most of the citizens who were upset about the corruption of the Ukrainian government, the accusations and probably valid accusations of widespread violence against journalists, against activists, and the drift towards Russia and the continuing difficult economic context. And so this uproar of citizens, where they spilled onto the streets and they made encampments on the Maidan, the central part of Kiev in the capital city, was called the Orange Revolution, because that was the color of the opposition political parties, which was led by Poroshenko and other Ukrainian politicians too. So this Orange Revolution was a very more or less a peaceful one, which fought for a redoing of the election which occurred, and then Yanukovych lost that election with Poroshenko, who was seen as a more Western-leading politician, gained power after the Orange Revolution. So this coming to power of Poroshenko, who was a more Western-orientated leader, helped also improve the economy as Ukraine started to open up a little bit more to the European Union, for example, to the rest of the so-called West in terms of its exports and imports, which helped to increase the hard currency that Ukrainian businesses could get by selling their agricultural and primary commodities to Europe. And so there was a slightly improving economic context. And this was also in the broader context, whereas we discussed previously, there was that food and fuel boom in the early 2000s where food was more expensive, fuel was more expensive, and Ukraine was exporting both of these types of products. So there was this increased ability because of the global political economy for Ukraine to earn more cash, basically. Now, however, this took a huge nosedive in the global financial crisis. Ukraine was one of the hardest hit countries in the global financial crisis. It's not mentioned very much, because obviously most of the focus is on the United States, as we've already looked at in a couple of weeks ago. But the global financial crisis actually wreaked huge amounts of havoc on Ukraine. Because what happened in Ukraine, Ukraine also had a banking sector which had lent out far more money than the banks actually had. And because the banks lent out huge amounts of sums to Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian households, which meant that households and businesses were over leveraged, and the banks basically didn't have enough money to cover the loans that they were lending out. And then what happened when the global financial crisis came along, because there was also a lot of foreign money in Ukrainian banks and was basically propping up Ukrainian banks because of the liberalization processes that had occurred previously, a lot of foreign money could, come in and out of Ukraine as it pleased, purchase banks and have lots of equity in banks and also keep banks afloat in Ukraine. Once the global financial crisis hit, where then all, international investors wanted to get their money to the US, because it seemed, despite all the chaos there, it still seemed like putting your money in American banks would be the safest thing to do in a crisis, which is usually the case of how we see investors react to crises. So then all this foreign money that were previous in the Ukrainian banking system got pulled out of it, and it could go because it was totally open. Financial flows were permitted after the huge amounts of liberalization throughout the 1990s. And then suddenly all the banks in Ukraine basically had no money whatsoever. And then once people stopped paying mortgages because they were too unaffordable because of the general state of the global political economy, with the increased costs of living, with the increased problems of debt, then the mortgages stopped being serviced. The banks then stopped receiving the money that they needed, and so they couldn't keep themselves continuing as a going concern. And then there's a huge collapse in the Ukrainian banking sector. There was then a huge collapse in Ukraine's industry, which relied on loans from the banking sector, and there was a GDP drop of about 25 or 30% in the first couple of years of the global financial crisis, as again people's pensions plummeted to practically nothing, people's wages were cut, huge numbers of job losses, and there was again widespread poverty with the global financial crisis. And it was hugely impactful in Ukraine. I really can't understate that, overstate that rather. I can't overstate how difficult it was in Ukraine at that time. Now, because of the economic tidal waves which are hitting Ukraine at this particular time, there then started to be a huge amounts of dissatisfaction with the Orange government, led by Poroshenko, and many of the reforms that Poroshenko had introduced were seen to be as to blame for the depth and severity of the economic crisis. And so there was a widespread disillusion with the Western focused Poroshenko Ukrainian government. And then in 2010, which is still, during the very much the after effects of the global financial crisis, Ukraine elected Yanukovych, who was the previous candidate who was implicated in election fixing in the early 2000s, which actually stimulated the Orange Revolution. He was back. And as I mentioned before, Yanukovych, again, like the other oligarchs around his so-called clan, as they're known in Ukraine, he heralded from the east, so from the Donbass region, which has the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are very important for the conflict which would erupt in a few years' time. Yanukovych was from this eastern region, and he was seen to be from a political party called the Party of Regions, and he was seen to be more Russian-leaning and would help repair somewhat the Russian relationship. Because one of the things that I didn't mention during this time was that because of the coming to power of Poroshenko, that who was that Western orientated president who emerged victorious after the Orange Revolution, Russia was generally very unhappy about the direction that Poroshenko was taking Ukraine, and there was discussions of integration into NATO, into the EU for Ukraine. There was increased cooperation between the West and Ukraine, and because of these overtures to the West by the Ukrainian government, twice during this period, the Russian government cut off gas flowing into Ukraine, which created a gas crisis, as it was called. And both these times are in the middle of winter. And so this created, again, a lot of, pain for the population. It also created a lot of anger with the European Union because they were the ones that are downstream from the pipes going through Ukraine. So it was also a point where Ukraine was stuck between Russia and the EU, with both sides blaming each other, and Ukraine's credibility as a transmitting country of these commodities also decreased at this time. So the election success of Yanukovych can be explained somewhat not only by the global financial crisis and the deleterious economic impacts of that, but also because the population was frustrated by the improper balancing, as it was seen, between the so-called West and Russian interests at that time, which had caused quite a bit of hurt to the broader population. So Yanukovych was elected at this time, and Yanukovych, even though he was, very much painted in most Western media as a purely pro-Russian Ukrainian president, it's actually not really entirely the case. Yanukovych was very much a political animal who did try to actively balance between the EU and other Western powers and Russia to try to get the best deal as he saw it for Ukraine and very much also for himself as well. Like I mentioned before, Yanukovych, like many of Ukraine's political leaders at this time, were oligarchs who had huge amounts of business interests in various economic industries in Ukraine. And so a lot of their decisions were arguably also favoring those business interests and the interests of those who also had their favor too. So Yanukovych was certainly balancing between these two poles of power, but certainly had lent more towards Russia than the previous government had. Now, at the end of 2013, Ukraine's ongoing economic crisis really wasn't getting any better. This was, continued issues from the global financial crisis. There was then imposition of austerity, but there wasn't really much of recovery. Now, by the end of 2013, the Yanukovych government was presented with a choice between either a huge $15 billion or so loan from Russia with not many strings attached, and then on the other hand, a much smaller loan from the International Monetary Fund, and also some support from the European Union, which was also far less than what Russia had offered. Now, at this time, Yanukovych and the Ukrainian government was also going to sign a trade agreement with the European Union. And because of this offer from Russia, he rejected that offer from the EU and from the IMF, and accepted the much larger loan from Russia, which the Ukrainian government had believed at this particular time would help them more with the economic crisis, but obviously would put them more in the pockets of the Russian government. Now, as many of you probably also are aware, this wasn't taken too kindly by a lot of the Ukrainian population, and there was a huge mobilization at the end of 2013, where people got onto the streets and started to protest against this decision. And then Yanukovych and the Ukrainian government subsequently cracked down really violently on these initial protests, which were of modest size and weren't particularly widespread in the early days. But then once the police started to crack down violently on protesters, people got more and more angry, and more people entered the streets until there was thousands upon thousands of people in every major city in Ukraine, and most famously in Kiev, where the citizens of Ukraine basically established a huge encampment around the square, or the Maidan, which then was the central place where the protests occurred against the Ukrainian government and where the most violence was. And this is also why the Western media termed this revolutionary process the Euromaidan, because they saw the Maidan protests and interpreted the Ukrainians' demands as wanting to go closer to Europe. Whereas other Ukrainian authors and other analysis have called it rather the revolution of dignity, because certainly, the turning towards the European Union and Europe in general was certainly a demand by a lot of the protesters at this stage, but there was even more important demands concurrently, which was about economic dignity, political participation, and other broader concerns than just the geopolitical one, which most of the Western media focuses on. Now, as this revolutionary process increased in size, where the encampment on Maidan became enormous, Maidan protesters started to occupy government buildings in Kiev, and which then led to increasingly violent clashes with police, until finally it got to a point where there was a very violent standoff between protesters and police, And it really seemed all over for the Yanukovych government. And Yanukovych fled to Russia as the protesters overran the Ukrainian parliament and his residence as well. And so he fled, and then there was a technocratic government established after the fall of the Yanukovych government. And so initially, this technocratic government was made up of many leaders of the revolutionary movement, which was not only part of the liberal segment of Ukrainian society, but also the nationalist and more right-wing leaning of the protesters, who were a really large presence during the Revolution of Dignity. Now, at this stage as well, once the technocratic government was established, and this was a non-elected government, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund then again entered into Ukraine to help the new government with economic reforms. Now, the World Bank and the IMF had not been in Ukraine really since 2010, since the Yanukovych government took over. And they came back after the technocratic government was established to advise them on their economic reforms. And this is also quite an unusual step, because typically the World Bank and the IMF do not deal with governments who are not democratically elected in what should be a democratic state. And so this was quite an odd development in the IMF and World Bank practice. Now, events after that also developed very quickly. In the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, where I mentioned before, there was there is as well a majority of Ukrainians there who speak Russian commonly in the everyday tongue. These Ukrainians in these areas also have very strong links to Russia, and have often family connections to Russia, and can trace their heritage back very closely to Russia as well. And so at this stage, when the Yanukovych government fell, Yanukovych fled, there was a lot of efforts by political figures in eastern and southern Ukraine to mobilize the population against these changes. And the Revolution of Dignity was painted as an attack on eastern and southern Ukraine. And this was also stimulated by a fear which a lot of political actors and so-called activists around these areas started to stoke up, and also very much Russian instigators who had crossed the border to instigate difficulties and concerns, to put it mildly, in the eastern parts of Ukraine. Basically, all these political operatives started to try to get the population to be really fearful of what was happening in the Revolution of Dignity, to see them as attack on themselves, to see it as more or less a revolution of far-right Ukrainians who were trying to force out the Russian ethnicities and the Russian language, and be in a direct attack on the east and southern parts of Ukraine. And as well, at the same time, this was a similar process happening in Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine located in the southern part of the country, which is kind of a connected island, you might say. It appears on the maps anyway, a connected island between Russia and the Ukrainian mainland, which is part of Ukraine. There was also a huge operation by political activists, you might call them, also Russian instigators, which had crossed over the border to create a lot of fear in Crimea. And very quickly, Crimea was seized by Russia. There was a call for help, which was falsely transmitted from Crimean politicians, which then the Russian government said they had to act upon and try to save the so-called ethnic Russians who were living in Crimea. And so then the Russian army invaded and seized Crimea really quickly in 2014. And then equally, in the eastern part of Ukraine, in this region called the Donbass, which includes Donetsk and Luhansk, these political efforts by different political operatives to seize up to or create a lot of concerns and worries in the population about these incoming far right nationalists from the capital city of Kiev, who will come and attack them. This also created, firstly, the appearance of a lot of armed militias who had seized weapons from police stations and military bases, and also the um, the movement of Russian troops into the Donbass, as well to train and equip these what were eventually called pro-Russian separatists, who then started to seize government buildings in the east. And they started to take over police stations, military barracks, administrative structures. It was somewhat echoing the tactics of the protesters on the Maidan. And the separatists were able to seize large parts of Donbass by the end of 2014. And once they started to do this, the new technocratic government then called upon volunteers, as well as the remaining parts of the Ukrainian armed forces who were in disarray after the revolution, to then confront the so-called pro-Russian separatists in the east. At this time, the involvement of the Russian government was not entirely obvious, and it was very much hidden. Obviously, excuse me, a lot of analysis later has pointed to the central role of not only the Russian government, but Russian-backed operatives who are acting in the Donbass to instigate and lead a lot of these pro-Russian separatists as they seized buildings. And they attempted to expand outwards and take as much of the Donbass as possible until they were met by Ukrainian forces, which then started to create a violent conflict, which is then termed the war in Donbass. Now, Poroshenko was elected to government, and now I apologize too. I realized I'd been calling the early 2000s Ukrainian President Poroshenko, which is not the case. Poroshenko was certainly around politically since the early 2000s, but was not one of the presidents, though he did run for presidency. Poroshenko was the first elected president of Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity. And Poroshenko was again also very much an oligarch, but located from the more central parts of Ukraine, and actually had a huge concern in Ukrainian candy, as it were, but was a very rich and successful oligarch. And he came to power with the promise to crush the pro-Russian separatists. And he increased the mobilization of the Ukrainian army to the Donbass, and there was a huge escalation in violence. Now, as the war in the Donbass continued to rage, there was more or less a huge stretch of territory, about 450 kilometers of territory in the east of Ukraine, which is like a line which is called the contact line, where there was continued skirmishes between both the pro-Russian separatists and then the Ukrainian military. By the end of 2014, and even well, we'll start with the end of 2014, the pro-Russian separatists started to make huge breaks and move towards the large cities of Mariupol and Dnipro as well. So this was obviously of huge concern. It started to become more and more obvious at this stage that the pro-Russian separatists were actually receiving heavy weapons from Russia as well. And in this context where Ukraine was on the back foot, they agreed to the first formal attempt at peace, which was the Minsk I peace agreement, which had called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the so-called contact line, which is the line the groups were fighting over, and also the exchange of prisoners and cessation of hostilities eventually. Now, the Minsk I agreement broke down very, very quickly, and so was totally really unsuccessful, and violence increased in 2015. And again, pro-Russian separatist forces really routed Ukraine in an important battle near the start of 2015, which also instigated the Minsk II peace agreements, which was very much like a re-emphasis on the Minsk I agreements and call to de-escalation with various steps to do so. as you probably everyone might be aware, that also totally failed as well. And from 2015 to 2022, and this does simplify things somewhat, the battle lines in the war in Donbass were more or less fixed. There was that 426-kilometer kind of line of territory, which is known as the contact line, where both parties would exchange fire on a day-to-day basis. There's continued civilian and military casualties. Most Western media outlets called it a frozen conflict or a stalemate, but it was very much an active conflict since 2014 until 2022, when Russia formally invaded. So there's continued death and destruction all along the 426 kilometers of contact line. Now, because of the war, the economic situation got really, really bad in Ukraine. So, like I mentioned, Crimea was seized by Russia. Major parts of the eastern areas of Ukraine, about 15% of the country, was also captured by pro-Russian separatists. And both of these areas contained huge amounts of important heavy industry that Ukraine relied upon economically. So things like steel mills, coal mines, some of the heavy chemical plants, huge amounts of agriculture, all these really important parts of their economy were suddenly not under their control anymore. And so Ukraine's GDP dropped by about 30% in the first 2 years of conflict. So the economic situation was really bad. There was a huge number of internally displaced people as well. About 1.5 million people fled the eastern parts of Ukraine. So then the rest of Ukraine had to absorb a lot of internally displaced people from the east. And then additionally to all of this, the wartime destruction, the loss of territory, the internal displacement, the death and the maiming, also at this time, and this is a central focus of my particular research, which I won't get into huge amounts of detail here. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank started to advise the Ukrainian wartime government on economic reforms that they should undertake. And the kind of interesting thing about this, or I guess the significant thing about this, is that typically the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank never get themselves involved in active conflict situations, as they call them. They've only kind of been accidentally involved in them before, but typically they kind of stay out of them. And I talk a little bit more about this in the main lecture of Lecture 10. So this was a unique situation where the IMF and the World Bank were advising a country on economic reforms as it was embroiled in war, which again was a kind of a huge development. And some of the main reforms that the World Bank and the IMF encourage Ukraine to do also tended to worsen the economic situation of most of the everyday people in Ukraine. So, for example, their gas reform was one of the major parts of the reform, and you'll see a paper on this in the recommended readings, where Ukraine removed all of the subsidies which had supported the population. They encouraged the Ukrainian government to sell off most of the assets of the Ukrainian gas network, which caused huge increases in prices for the population, just as the violence of the war started to increase. Secondly, there was also land reform as well, which has a very long history in Ukraine, but basically made it much easier for huge multinational agro corporations to buy up large amounts of land in Ukraine, which then meant a lot of people lost the ability to work on their farms and grow foods for themselves, which decreased food security. And then the increase in gigantic agricultural farms, which are, some of these in Ukraine are like 50 times the size of like the biggest European farms, also cause huge ecological problems where there's huge amounts of agricultural chemical runoff into water systems. There was huge amounts of lost vitality of the soil, which then made it really difficult to grow lots of things. And so the agrarian reforms that we saw in Ukraine at this time damaged the food security and ecological health of the country. And finally, and another example of reforms at this stage was the pension reform. And this one was had a lot of significant impacts where basically the pensions were capped and then reduced. So then, elderly retired Ukrainians received much less money than they had previously and became quite insecure, which then meant that they would often move back into the homes of their daughters most commonly, and then the women of the household would have to increase their labor to look after the elderly Ukrainians who then couldn't support themselves. And additionally, the Ukrainian government mandated that they wouldn't pay any pensions to any pensioners living in the areas of the country that were controlled by the pro-Russian separatists, which also engendered a huge movement of pensioners across the war zone, which is incredibly dangerous. But then about 600,000 pensioners fled the war zone, not only because of the violence, but a large part of it was because they couldn't access their pensions anymore, and so they moved into Ukraine, the parts controlled by the Ukrainian government, to then be able to access their pension. But then those huge amounts of problems with this also meant that the elderly people were going to other, family homes, which increased the burden of labor for women across the country. And so these kind of economic impacts helped deepen the severity of the everyday crisis in Ukraine. Now, this is the context of difficult economic situation, increasing violence, where Zelensky, who's the current president of Ukraine, was elected in 2019. And so my one of my field research trips was just before the election of Zelensky in 2019. And at this time, there was a huge, everyone was really fed up with the candidates that they were used to, which were basically all oligarchs again. And so Zelensky, who was a comedian, was elected more or less on a landslide and defeated the incumbent Poroshenko quite comfortably in the end, even though Zelensky didn't really have much of a policy platform. He more or less campaigned on his difference to the oligarchic candidates, and also he also made overtures to trying to find a peaceful solution to the war in Donbass. So he was elected, but suddenly Ukraine was hit by yet another crisis, which was COVID-19. And once again, Ukraine was severely hit by COVID-19, which isn't often really spoken about. But they had a huge number of casualties from the virus itself. The lockdowns in Ukraine also created gigantic economic problems as well. And the country was severely hit by COVID-19 in many different aspects. The impacts of COVID-19 also meant that there was additional pressure on the Zelensky government to implement the neoliberal reforms demanded by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so Zelensky quickly became increasingly unpopular. And even by 2021, the end of 2021, if there was an election in Ukraine, Zelensky would have most comfortably lost out, and his political party, Servants of the People, were starting to lose a lot of regional and local elections. And so Zelensky was in a very difficult place at this particular time. However, there were some positive steps towards peace. There was increased prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. There was demining operations, taking away landmines from different parts of the contact line. There was the removal of heavy weapons in certain places, the increase of ways of people to get across the contact line as well. So there was some positive steps towards peace at this time. However, 2021 then was a totally different kettle of fish, where the President Biden, importantly in this story, I guess, came to be president, and then Zelensky met him quite early on, and there was discussions about, could Ukraine join NATO, for example, and obviously the Russian government didn't take too kindly to any kind of suggestions that Ukraine might be drifting any further out of its orbit. There was also a kind of incredibly wacky essay that was written by Russia's Russian President Putin during the COVID pandemic, where he wrote an incredibly long essay about how Ukraine and Russia are brotherly countries and are just one people and should be together. And so there was increased concern from Ukraine that Russia might try to increase their aggression in the country. And then Russia, on the other side, started to think that the Zelensky Ukrainian government were drifting more and more to the West and were imminently going to join NATO. So then you started to have this huge mobilization of Russian troops throughout 2021 on the Russian side of the Ukrainian border. This was something that was not actually typically like unusual per se across the, since 2014, because there had always been quite a lot of, mobilizations of Russian troops every now and then to create political and military pressure on Ukraine. But it was certainly increased across 2021. However, a lot of analysts really dismissed the warnings during 2021 about the any further incoming aggression and kind of put down a lot of the mobilizations to the chest beating of the Russian government, and that it wouldn't really amount to much. However, we now know that that wasn't the case, and Russia did invade formally in Ukraine in 2022, again on a pretext where they said that the Donetsk and Luhansk people had called for their help because of increased Ukrainian aggression. That was also obviously something that was very much staged to help justify Russia's invasion. Now, I apologize too. I probably should have put a bit of a map before if anyone's not really that familiar with Ukraine, but this doesn't show all of Ukraine, just part of it. But these are the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of the broader Donbass region in the eastern part of the country. That's the capital, Kiev, and Crimea is further down southeast here. But Russia invaded all across the eastern part, also the northern part of the country and the southern part of the country, seizing huge amounts of territory, which stretched from above Kiev, the capital city, towards the northeast part of the country. There's a very major city around here called Kharkiv, which they also seized territory around there initially, and expanded the holdings of the so-called pro-Russian separatists, who are now totally integrated into the Russian army, expanded their control of the Donbass region as well. And I'll show you some of the most updated maps quite soon. But this multi-pronged invasion, and again, many of you probably remember this quite clearly, was eventually repelled, especially around Kiev, even though still large parts of the country was seized and under Russian control. The entire Western world mobilized against Russia, helped Ukraine in lots of different facets in terms of military supply, economic support. The World Bank was particularly central to increasing the donations and loans heading to Ukraine as well. And as well as huge amounts of sanctions applied on Russia too. Now, by the end of 2022, there was a large counterattack by Ukraine, where Ukraine regained most of its territory around Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. But Russia had still maintained control over large parts of the Donbass, as well as the southeast regions of Ukraine too. Now, across 2023 to this year, there's a kind of continued exchange of territory between both Russia and Ukraine. Was it last year now? Last year there was a much anticipated offensive by Ukraine against Russian forces, where they did make some grounds in the south and in the east, but those were quickly reversed as Russia's re-offensive started to become more and more effective. And of course, Russia had continued to utilize drone attacks and airstrikes on a lot of really critical Ukrainian infrastructure, which had also created huge amounts of pain for the Ukrainian population, as most of the country was plunged into darkness regularly. And then the continued fear of airstrikes and drone strikes was something that was constantly on the mind of Ukrainians. And again, because of the huge economic issues of the war, as well as the increasing and continued neoliberal reforms pushed by the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the economic situation continued to deteriorate in Ukraine as poverty increased. And it was more and more difficult for the conflict-affected population to survive and reproduce themselves on a daily basis. And Russia has now more recently continued making steady small gains, which I'll point out to you quite soon on some maps. And significantly this year, and just a couple of months ago, Ukraine launched an attack into the Kursk region of Russia, which is a region just next to Ukraine's eastern border, in an attempt to seize territory which could then bargain for the territory that Russia had seized from it. I'll show you what this looks like, but it's quite a small and circumscribed part of Russian territory. Ukraine had made some quite sensational gains early on, but these are now being reversed or at least stabilized by the Russian counterattack. Now, in this situation and in this context, we have to ask ourselves, what hope for peace is there? And this is maybe something that I want you to all reflect on, and certainly not something I'm going to offer any prescriptions for. But I want you to think about, firstly, what hope is there for peace on an interstate level between Ukraine and Russia, but also more, maybe just as importantly, what hope is there for peace at the everyday level for Ukrainian citizens, not just from the violence of the active war zone and Russian drones and airstrikes and artillery and all the explicit violence of war, but also what hope is there for a positive peace where people can live in with justice and dignity and be able to have their everyday needs met without going into poverty. This is also a really important question and something that political economy analysis can look at, because we can see not only the impacts on the everyday living of Ukrainians in this situation, for example, or other peoples impacted by war during active conflict itself, and the violence of that active conflict, but also can analyze the parts of the war zone and the conflict-affected country which isn't picked up by most mainstream analysts, which is about the economic changes that are happening concurrently in the particular country, which also has a huge impact on the everyday ability for people to live and survive. So these are some of the things I want you to think about, and something that political economy can really contribute to these contemporary wars. Now, just very briefly, this is, again, I probably should have pointed out a map like this near the start of the presentation, because I apologize, probably not everyone may be familiar with the geography of Ukraine. But this is a very updated map from the 22nd of September. I'm recording this on, what's the date? My God, what is the date? 24th of September. So this is 2 days ago. And these are updated kind of the day before. So I got this update yesterday about the day before. And so the red here shows the parts of Ukraine that are under Russian control. The striped areas here, you can see Donetsk, which is one part of the Donbass region. The Donbass is this region I'm indicating here. This is Donetsk and this is Luhansk. The stripy parts indicate the regions that were previously controlled by Russia and the so-called pro-Russian separatists before the formal Russian invasion. And this is Crimea down the bottom of the country here. And as you can see, the Russian invasion has expanded the control quite significantly through more parts of the east and also the south of the country too. And we're going to zoom in on some of these lines of contact here, which are these circles representing intense fighting in the previous week. And you can also see there has been a small Russian incursion more recent. This is earlier in the year, just above the city of Kharkiv. And I don't think it's illustrated here, but I'll show you the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk in Russia, which is around this part here. So now this is a zoom in to this top part of the map here, this top part of the eastern part of the country. This is Luhansk. Here you can see this is the line of contact as we describe it now, which is more fluid than it was during the war in Donbass, where the Russian military is making steady gains throughout most of this northern part of the Eastern Front. you can see, for instance, that Russian forces are seizing different villages and are advancing in a number of positions here, as Ukraine's capacity to kind of repel um, uh, Russian gains, even though they are quite minor, is starting to be reduced as Ukraine's economic crisis worsens, as the military support for Ukraine also starts to falter by the West, and none of these gains by Russia are particularly gigantic, but they are steady and they are most days when, especially me, I check these updates on a daily basis. These are continuing at a slow and steady rate. And as you can see, for example, many of you may have heard about the Battle of Bakhmut, which was happened last year. You can see this is where Bakhmut, the city was, and so Russia has now eclipsed that by quite a bit, which kind of gives you an idea of the speed. It's not hugely fast, but it's not insignificant either. And so let's go down south a little bit more. So that's Bakhmut we just mentioned before. And now we're just a little bit further down south. Again, huge amounts of fighting around this region. This blued out region here, this is where the Donetsk city is. And you can see this dark black line here was the previous controlled territory in before the formal Russian invasion of 2022. And again, recorded Russian advances in most of these positions. The blue here was the previous Ukrainian summer counter-offensive that I noted, but also more recently too. There's been small gains by Ukraine in parts of the field of battle, and we'll now go a little bit more south. So this is now the southern part of the country, and Crimea is kind of down here. There hasn't been as much significant fighting here, but this was one of the large focuses of the Ukraine counteroffensive last year, where there's actually quite large gains into these areas by the Ukrainian military. But as you can see, they've now been almost totally repelled slowly by Russia over the last year. So it is quite a difficult front for Ukraine across the south and the east. But even in the last couple of days, Ukraine is starting to strike more into Russian territory against military installations and weapons depots, which has been a new development, because typically Ukraine hadn't been striking that deep in Russia. And you can see this is a little snapshot of the field that we're kind of looking at here. So this map that we're looking at here. So this is a better map, excuse me. So we've just been looking at this the region in red here, the conflict zone, and just north here around Sumy in Ukraine, you can see this is the Kursk Oblast of Russia, or the Kursk region or state is another way we can think about what oblast means. The blue here is Ukraine's attack into Russia. In the last few days, this has been met by much stronger Russian counter-offensive than initially when the Ukrainian military launched this Kursk offensive. Russia was kind of scrambling and I think was taken by quite by surprise. But now it looks like Russia might be slowly starting to seize momentum, though Ukraine is still making gains here. So you can see this is quite a complicated battlefield, and it is very mobile and very dynamic. And it is something that, I think we should all continue to think about in terms of our political economy lens and in understanding this conflict. And I haven't really spoken too much about the drivers of this particular conflict here, but some of the recommended resources go into it a little bit too. But again, it very much a very important consideration from political economy analysis, which departs from the mainstream views of this, which, for instance, international relations just focus on the geopolitics here. Some sources just focus on Putin as a single solitary explanation, but there is a much other deeper factors that we can talk about in terms of the political economy, in terms of maybe the economic reasons for this, the political ones, and how they also interact to not only create this conflict but sustain it. And this kind of analysis, where we're looking at the drivers of conflict and the impacts of the conflict on everyday people, is a really important thing that political economy analysis can bring to not only this contemporary conflict, but unfortunately there are many others that are raging around the world today. So, I mean, I hope that was maybe a little bit interesting, talking about one of the contemporary conflicts, which is unfortunately raging today. And I mentioned I study quite a few of them, but this is quite maybe oddly and yeah, unfortunately for many reasons, the least controversial one to talk about. So yeah, I hope that was interesting for you, and we look forward to seeing you in tutorials this week. Thank you very much, team.